right, so are you ready?
Ready for what?
Well, for a deep dive, obviously.
And
Today, we're going to be looking at Sanyika Shakur, using excerpts from his Wikipedia page. And
Wikipedia?
yeah, his Wikipedia bio specifically. And just let me tell you,
Yeah.
this is not your typical gangster story.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
this guy, he went from literally calling himself Monster
Monster.
to, like, challenging the systems that kind of created him in the first place.
Yeah.
It's wild.
That's the question, right? Can you, like, escape your past?
Totally. Like, can you ever really outrun where you came from? And in his case, I mean, where he came from was pretty,
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
it's rough to even read about it. Like, he was born Kody Scott.
In 63.
Yeah, 1963.
Yeah.
And, like, right from the start, his dad was abusive. His mom was working, like, every job she could just to get by.
Not exactly, a stable environment to grow up in.
Not at all. Makes you wonder, like, how much of a choice he even had, you know?
Yeah. And that's where the pull of the streets comes in, right?
Yeah.
Especially with Stanley Tookie Williams around.
Oh, yeah. Tookie Williams and the West Side Crips, huge presence in his neighborhood.
And this isn't just like some abstract gang influence. We're talking about Williams later in life, like expressing remorse for being a bad influence on Kody.
Oh, wow. Like, actually feeling responsible for...
Yeah.
Yeah.
For leading him down the wrong path. Imagine that, right? Being a kid, seeing that kind of power, that violence, and then the guy behind it all says, hey, sorry I messed you up.
Yeah, that's heavy. Talk about, like, a messed up mentorship or something.
But twisted, totally.
And it's in that environment that at 12 years old, Kody gets initiated into the Eight Tray Gangster Crips.
12 years old.
Yeah. And, you know, the jumping in ritual is basically just getting the crap beaten out of you on.
Welcoming you to the gang, right? But with fists.
Brutal. Like, that's your intro to this life.
Yeah, no more watching from the sidelines. You're part of it now. And at that age,
Yeah.
it's going to change you, harden you.
And then just a year later, things get even more intense. He's 13, and he earns the nickname Monster after brutally beating a robbery victim.
It's hard to even, it's a horrific act. And it makes you wonder, right, how much did that name, that label stick with him? Did it become like a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Oh, totally. Like, does the name become the mask, you know?
Huh.
Does it separate him from the violence, or maybe even justify it in his mind?
Just like a shield, almost.
Yeah, a shield. And the violence just keeps escalating. At 14, he shoots at a fast food worker. He's in and out of juvenile detention. And then things really explode. Tookie Williams gets arrested for murder. The founder of the Crips, Raymond Washington, is killed. And it's all-out war between different Crip sets.
You got to remember, this is 1980s LA, right? Gang violence is everywhere. It's about turf, drugs, and just this constant fight for power, for survival.
Sounds like a war zone, honestly. And for a young man like Kody, violence becomes his whole world.
Yeah. And it almost consumes him. He's only 16 when he gets ambushed, shot 6 times. His younger brother, Kershawn, retaliates with a whole string of shootings.
Oh, wow. Just an endless cycle.
Endless.
Like, at this point, you'd think the story's already written, right? He's trapped, no way out.
Yeah.
But then there's this twist. He ends up in prison.
Yeah.
And that's where things start to shift.
And it all begins with a pretty unexpected encounter. He meets members of the Republic of New Africa movement.
Wait, the group that wants, like, a separate black nation within the U.S.?
That's the one. Pretty radical, right?
Yeah.
And they expose him to this whole new way of thinking, ideas about self-determination, black empowerment.
And for someone like him,
Yeah.
struggling with who he is, where he fits in, I can see how that would be powerful.
Oh, absolutely. It's like he's finally given a new lens to view the world through. And that's when the real change starts happening. He reads everything he can get his hands on, educates himself, and eventually changes his name to Sanyika Shakur.
He sheds that monster persona
Mm-hmm.
and chooses a new identity. It's like a rebirth, right?
Yeah, it's a complete rejection of the path that was laid out for him. He's saying, I'm going to create myself.
It's a powerful statement. And when he gets out of prison in '88, there's a glimmer of hope. He marries his girlfriend, Tamu.
Seemed like he's building a new life, right? But of course, with Sanyika Shakur, it's never that straightforward.
Right, because in 1991, he's back in prison. Assault and grand theft auto.
And while he's locked up, something massive happens. The 1992 LA riots.
Whoa, hold on. He's in prison while his city is burning, while members of his old gang are out there in the chaos.
It must have been surreal, like watching a nightmare unfold from a distance, but still feeling connected to it.
Yeah, connected through his past, his people.
It's like a forced reflection, a moment to really grapple with the consequences of the life he left behind. And it's during this time that he writes, Monster, the autobiography of an LA gang member.
It's like he had to write it at that point,
Yeah.
like to make sense of it all, for himself and for everyone else.
It's more than just a memoir, though. It's a raw look at gang life, a commentary on society, and a warning about how destructive these forces can be.
But even with all this transformation, his connection to the gang world, to the violence he grew up with, it's not completely severed.
And that's where things get really interesting. He forms a friendship with another Shakur.
You mean Tupac Shakur?
Wow.
Like the rapper, the icon?
Yep. And they weren't just like acquaintances, they had a genuine connection. It's fascinating, isn't it? He's trying to move away from his past, yet he's drawn to this figure who, in a lot of ways, represents the very culture he's trying to escape.
This is that push and pull, who he was, who he's trying to be. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Super complicated.
Yeah. So where were we? Oh, yeah, Sanyika and Tupac. They're friends, right?
Yeah, and in '96, things get even crazier. Sanyika's on the run from the police, and he ends up meeting up with Tupac on a music video set.
Wait, like a chance encounter? Yeah, but looking back, it's kind of eerie,
Yeah.
Like foreshadowing. Because it turns out to be the last time they see each other.
Because of what happened to Tupac, you mean?
Exactly. Just a few months later, Tupac's murdered in Vegas. Tragic.
Absolutely tragic.
And Sanyika, he's still wrestling with his own past, trying to find his way, and he decides to do something pretty bold. He interviews Orlando Anderson, the guy who's supposedly shot Tupac, for Vibe magazine.
Whoa, hold on. He actually talked to the alleged killer.
Yep. Gets right to the source.
I can't even imagine. So what happened? What did Anderson say?
Well, that interview leads Sanyika to another notorious figure, Suge Knight, the head of Death Row Records. He's locked up with Anderson at the time.
Suge Knight. Okay, yeah, this is getting intense. So what went down between them?
It's like something out of a movie. Knight claims that Tupac owed him money, even though Tupac had sold millions of records.
Really?
Yeah, and he talks about controlling Tupac's possessions, the whole thing. And then Knight confirms that, yeah, Anderson was the one who killed Tupac.
Wow. That's chilling. It's like a glimpse into this whole dark side of the music industry. The world Tupac was caught up in, The power, the danger.
Absolutely. And for Sanyika, it's got to be another layer of tragedy, another reminder of the violence that seems to follow him, even as he's trying to build a new life.
It's like he can't escape it. But even after all of that, he doesn't give up. He keeps writing, trying to make sense of it all.
Right. He publishes his first fiction book, Thuglife, and later a collection of essays called Stand Up, Struggle Forward.
So it's not just about his past anymore. He's tackling bigger issues, right? Like race, class, the impact of trauma.
Yeah, for sure. You see a more introspective, analytical side of Shakur in these works. He's pushing himself and his readers to think critically about, the systems that create inequality and violence.
And even when he's back in prison at Centinela and Solano, he's still finding ways to use his voice. He's part of the Uncuffed radio program, right?
That's right. He's always looking for a platform to share his thoughts, to start a conversation, to challenge the way things are.
It's like they can lock him up, but they can't silence him.
You said earlier that his transformation in prison seemed inevitable, but I wonder about that.
What do you mean?
Well, lots of people go to prison and don't come out with such a radical change in their thinking. What was different about Sanyika? Was it meeting the Republic of New Africa? Was it his hunger for knowledge? Or was there something more, something within him all along?
It's a good question. Maybe he was just a seeker,
Yeah.
Always questioning, challenging, pushing himself to grow.
Yeah, despite all the setbacks, all his flaws, there was this drive in him to break free from his past, from the limitations placed on him.
It really makes you think about the power of personal change,
It does, but it also highlights how complicated that change is. It's not a straight line. There are going to be bumps, wrong turns, even steps backward.
And for Shakur, there's this tragic irony. He spends his life trying to create a different future, and he ends up living in a homeless encampment.
It's a world away from the violence of his youth, but it shows that the path to redemption isn't always easy or pretty.
Yeah, and it reminds us that even with personal transformation, the past leaves scars. And coming back to society, especially after prison, especially with his history, it can be incredibly tough.
It makes you wonder about the support systems that are or aren't in place for people who've been incarcerated, especially for those who've challenged the system itself.
Like, are we setting them up to fail?
It's a tough question, but one that Shakur's story forces us to ask. But it also makes what he did achieve even more impressive. He went from monster to author, activist, a voice for the voiceless.
And his death in 2021 from a stroke, it doesn't erase that impact. The power of his words, the questions he raised.
You asked earlier, can someone truly escape their past? I think Shakur's life, with all its ups and downs, contradictions, gives us a complicated answer.
Yeah, because on one hand, he never fully outran his past. The violence, the trauma, it was always there.
But on the other hand, he never stopped trying to move beyond it, to learn, to grow, to make amends. And in that way, maybe he did find a kind of freedom, a freedom that wasn't about his circumstances, but about who he was inside.
It's a powerful idea that even within the limitations of his life, he found a way to redefine himself, to challenge the story that had been written for him.
And through his writing, he challenged us to do the same, to look past the labels, the judgments, and see the humanity in everyone.
It's a message that's so important today, when it's so easy to divide people, to put them in boxes. Sanyika Shakur's life reminds us that we're all more than our pasts, that we all have the potential to grow and change.
And that even when things are tough, when it seems impossible, we can choose a different path.
Okay, before we move on, I want to go back to something you mentioned about the '92 riots. You said it was like this huge moment of reflection for Shakur. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. Imagine being locked up while your city is on fire, knowing that your former gang is out there, caught up in the violence. It must have been surreal, like a bad dream you can't wake up from.
He was physically removed from the chaos, but still connected to it through his past, through the people he knew.
Exactly. And I think that experience, that perspective, really shaped his writing. It gave him this unique understanding of the riots, of the years of tension that led up to them.
He wasn't just some observer. It was personal for him.
Yeah, definitely. And that made his writing so powerful, so raw. He wasn't afraid to name names, to call out the hypocrisy he saw, both in the gangs and in the larger systems that create inequality.
It's like he was saying, I was there. I saw it. This is what you need to understand.
Exactly. And by telling his own story, he made people confront their own biases, their own ideas about gang members, about the communities they come from.
He's saying, look, I did terrible things, but I'm also a human being. My story is complicated. It's not so simple.
And that's what makes his work so important. It breaks down stereotypes and reminds us that there's humanity in everyone, even in the most unexpected places.
It reminds us that even in the darkest places, there's still hope for growth, for change, for finding a different way.
And that's a powerful message, especially in a world that's so quick to judge.
When we talk about Sanyika Shakur and the impact of environment, what are we really getting at here? Because that seems like a huge part of his story.
Absolutely. His childhood was rough. Poverty, abuse, gangs everywhere. It's hard to imagine a tougher environment to grow up in.
And those early experiences, they definitely shaped his choices, the path he took.
But what's important to remember is that where you come from doesn't determine who you are or who you can become.
And Shakur's transformation in prison, that proves it right. He chose to educate himself, to challenge his own beliefs, to break free from the violence.
It wasn't easy, and he stumbled along the way, but he never gave up on trying to be better.
That's so inspiring. It tells us that even when things are hard, we have the power to change, to rise above our circumstances.
But we also have to acknowledge that it's not always that simple. There are systemic barriers. Poverty, racism, lack of education, lack of resources. Those things make it incredibly difficult for some people to escape violence, to escape poverty.
So it's not just about individual willpower. We have to address the bigger issues, the systems that create these problems in the first place.
You got it. Sanyika Shakur's story shows us that we need social change. We need to create opportunities for people who've been marginalized, left behind.
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in breaking down those barriers and building a better world, a more just world.
And that's a conversation we need to have, especially now. Sanyika Shakur's life may be over, but his story is still relevant. It challenges us to be better, to do better, to make a world where everyone has a chance to succeed.
I think we need a minute to process all of that. Phew, man, that was heavy.
Yeah, no kidding.
Sanyika Shakur's life really makes you think.
Doesn't it? It's just so many layers, individual choices, but also like the whole system, And then what does it even mean to find redemption after all that?
Yeah, and that question we started with, can someone truly escape their past? What do you think after going through all this?
I don't know. It's tough. Like, on the surface, you could say no, not really. The things he did, the things that happened to him, they stayed with him.
That monster label, it followed him everywhere, even when he was trying so hard to be someone different.
Right. But here's the thing. He never stopped trying to change. He kept learning, pushing himself, even when he was back in prison. That fight to become more than his past, that's going to count for something, right?
It's like finding a different kind of freedom, almost, like inside himself.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message for anyone, anyone who's struggling with their past, with things they regret. It tells us that it's possible to change, to grow, even when it seems impossible.
But we can't forget about the bigger picture either. His story isn't just about him. It's about the systems that keep people trapped in poverty, in violence.
Absolutely. He's showing us how those systems work, how they impact people's lives.
Like, look, I messed up, but I mess up in this context. And that context, those systems, that's on all of us.
Right. And that's a challenge, isn't it? It's not enough to just blame individuals. We have to address the root causes of these problems.
Okay, so what can we do? Like, what can people listening actually do with this knowledge? It's so big,
Yeah.
It feels overwhelming.
I get it. It's easy to feel powerless. But Shakur's life, it gives us a few ideas.
Like what?
First, just become aware. Educate yourself. Read his books. Learn about gang culture, about what was happening back then. The more you understand, the more you can do something about it.
Don't just believe everything you hear.
Right.
Dig deeper, question things.
Exactly. And talk about it. Have those tough conversations with people. Share what you've learned. Push back against the status quo. Ask the hard questions.
Because if we don't talk about it, nothing changes.
Yeah. And remember, change starts with us. Look at your own biases, your own prejudices. We all have them. And work on changing those ways of thinking.
It's a process, right? It's a journey.
Totally. And it's not always easy. But just like Shakur never stopped trying to transform himself, we can't stop working for a better world.
So for everyone listening, what's the one thing you'd tell them to do now?
Go read something by Sanyika Shakur. Let his words sink in. Let them challenge you. Let his story inspire you to make a difference.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been incredible.
Thanks for having me. It's been a privilege.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. And until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a world where everyone can thrive.